To get started with AWS Amplify identity pools, you first need to understand what they are and how they work. Identity pools are used to manage user access to AWS resources, providing temporary AWS credentials to users who are authenticated with an identity provider. Step 1 is to set up an AWS Amplify project. This involves installing the AWS Amplify CLI and initializing a new project. Once you have your project set up, you can move on to the next step. Step 2 is to configure your identity pool. This involves creating an identity pool in the AWS Management Console, and then configuring the authentication providers you want to use, such as Amazon Cognito user pools, Facebook, or Google. Step 3 is to set up your authentication providers. If you are using Amazon Cognito user pools, you will need to create a user pool and configure the settings as needed. If you are using a social media provider, you will need to register your application and obtain an app ID and app secret. Step 4 is to integrate your identity pool with your application. This involves installing the AWS Amplify library and importing it into your application code. You will then need to use the library to authenticate users and obtain temporary AWS credentials. Step 5 is to use the temporary AWS credentials to access AWS resources. Once you have authenticated a user and obtained temporary credentials, you can use those credentials to access AWS resources such as S3 buckets or DynamoDB tables. Best practices for using AWS Amplify identity pools include using secure authentication protocols, monitoring your identity pool for suspicious activity, and regularly reviewing and updating your authentication settings. It is also important to follow AWS security best practices, such as using IAM roles and policies to control access to AWS resources. By following these steps and best practices, you can use AWS Amplify identity pools to securely manage user access to your AWS resources. This allows you to focus on building your application, rather than worrying about user authentication and authorization.